Welcome, traveler of the night. You have found your way to the Silver Palace, but not to its gold-leafed halls or its noisy ballrooms. No. We are deep beneath the surface, where the air is cool and smells of ancient parchment, lavender, and the weight of centuries. Take a deep breath. Let the world outside turn to gray. Here in this library, time does not move, it only lingers. I am the scribe of shadows. My life is measured in ink drops and the rustle of turning pages. For years I have lived within these stone walls, recording the names of kings who are now dust, and wars that are now just ink on a map. I thought I knew everything about this palace. I thought I knew the rhythm of its silence. But then, the night changed. The heavy oak doors, reinforced with iron and history, groaned on their hinges. A sound that shouldn't have happened at 3 in the morning. The light of a single candle flickered violently. I looked up from my desk, my eyes tired from the dim light. And there she stood, the queen. But she was not the woman I saw on the balcony during the parades. There was no crown upon her head. Her hair, usually pinned up in complex braids of gold and jewels, was falling like a dark, chaotic waterfall over her shoulders. She looked pale, almost translucent in the moonlight that filtered through the high, narrow windows. She didn't look like a ruler. She looked like a prisoner who had finally found the key. She didn't see me at first. I was just a part of the furniture, tucked away in my corner of shadows. She walked slowly, her silk dress whispering against the cold marble floor. Swish, swish, swish. The sound was more melodic than any music I had ever heard. She stopped by the great window that overlooked the cliffs. The sea was raging below, but she looked at it with a strange envy. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, her breath fogging the glass. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 years. "The stars are different from here," she said softly. Her voice wasn't a command. It was a sigh, a velvet melody that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the wall. I realized then that she knew I was there. She had always known. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor, a harsh sound in such a delicate moment. I bowed, but not the way I was taught. It was a bow of recognition, one soul to another. "They are lonelier from here, Your Majesty," I replied. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, thick with the dust of the books I had been reading. She turned her head slightly, looking at me over her shoulder. Her eyes were not the cold sapphire the poets described. They were tired. Deeply, painfully tired. "Why do you stay here, scribe? In the dark, among the dead?" she asked. I looked at the ink on my fingers, the permanent mark of my station. "Because the dead don't ask for anything and the dark doesn't judge me," I said. She turned fully then, her silk gown shimmering like moonlight on water. She stepped closer, and for the first time, I felt the warmth radiating from her. The scent of dried lavender and something else. Something like rain on hot stone. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the ancient book I had been transcribing. Her skin was so white it almost glowed. "Tell me," she whispered, "in all these books, in all these records of glory and blood, is there a single page about freedom? Is there a story where the bird doesn't have to die to leave the cage?" I looked at her, and for a moment, the world vanished. There was no palace, no king, no guards outside the door. Just a woman asking a question that the universe had forgotten how to answer. I felt a dangerous urge to reach out and touch her hand, to tell her that her cage was made of gold, but it was still a cage. I began to speak, not from the books, but from the dreams I had kept hidden in the margins of my ledgers. I told her of a place beyond the northern mountains, where the wind speaks in a language of forgotten gods, and where no one asks who your father was. She listened with an intensity that was frightening. Every word I spoke seemed to be a drop of water on parched earth. The candle on my desk finally sputtered and died, leaving us in the deep blue embrace of the moon. We were two silhouettes in a sea of forgotten knowledge. The hours passed like minutes. We spoke of things that were forbidden, not because they were evil but because they were true. She told me of the weight of the crown, how it felt like a cold band of iron tightening around her thoughts every day. I told her of the freedom I found in my mind, how I could travel the world while sitting in a wooden chair. For one night, the scribe was a king and the queen was a girl again. But the sky was beginning to turn a pale, bruised purple in the east. The dream was ending. "I must go," she said, her voice barely a breath. She reached out and for the briefest second, her fingertips brushed against my ink-stained hand. It was like a spark of lightning in a dark room. A touch that could cost us both our lives. She didn't look back as she walked toward the heavy doors. "Don't write about this night, Scribe," she whispered. "Some stories are too beautiful to be kept on paper." I watched her disappear into the shadows of the corridor. The library felt colder than it ever had before. I picked up my quill but the ink had dried. The first chapter of our tragedy had been written in the air, and the scent of lavender was all that remained. The sun rose after that night, but for me the light felt colder. Every record I wrote, every name of a lord or a tax collector felt like ash in my mouth. My eyes kept wandering to the heavy oak doors, waiting for a ghost that might never return. I was a man haunted by the scent of lavender and the memory of a touch that could burn down a kingdom. 3 days passed. The palace was loud with the preparations for the spring gala. I could hear the laughter of the nobles from the gardens, their voices sharp and empty like broken glass. I stayed in my basement of books, my sanctuary of dust. But then a young page arrived. He didn't speak. He only laid a single white rose on my desk, a rose that was already wilting, its edges tinged with a faint, familiar ink. It was a summons. Not a royal decree but a silent cry. That night the storm was my only companion. I waited until the guards changed their shifts, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't go to the library this time. I followed the narrow service stairs, the ones used by servants and shadows. My destination was the east balcony, a place where the wind screams so loud that whispers can finally be heard. She was there, standing against the stone railing, wrapped in a heavy cloak of midnight blue. The rain was lashing at the palace, but she didn't seem to care. She looked smaller tonight, as if the weight of her titles was finally crushing her bones. I stayed in the shadows, afraid that my presence would break the silence. "You came," she said without turning around. Her voice was thin, like a thread of silk caught in a gale. I stepped into the light of a distant torch. "I couldn't stay away, my lady." The silence in the library was louder than the storm, I replied. She turned then and I saw a bruise, not on her skin but in her spirit. Her husband, the king, was a man made of iron and ego. He didn't see a woman when he looked at her. He saw a crown he had conquered. She reached out, her hand trembling as she pulled a small leather-bound book from her cloak. "I found this in the old archives," she whispered. "It's a map, not of lands but of stars, stars that led to the sea." We leaned over the map, our heads almost touching. I could feel the warmth of her breath on my cheek, a contrast to the icy rain that soaked our clothes. Our fingers met on the worn parchment, tracing paths that led to nowhere and everywhere. In that moment we weren't a queen and a scribe. We were two explorers lost in a world that didn't want us. If we followed these, she murmured, where would we be by dawn? I looked at her, the water dripping from her hair, and for a second I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a hope so bright it was terrifying. But then a sound. The heavy thud of boots on the stone steps below. The guards. We froze, our breaths held in our lungs. The maps, the stars, the dreams, they all felt like a death sentence. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Hide, she hissed. I stepped back into the pitch-black alcove of a gargoyle, my back pressed against the cold, wet stone. I watched as she straightened her back, her face turning into a mask of marble as the captain of the guard appeared. Your Majesty? The king is asking for you, the captain said, his voice suspicious. She didn't flinch. She stood like a goddess of the storm, her cloak billowing around her. I was only watching the sea, Captain. It is restless tonight, much like the kingdom, she said with a coldness that made my blood run chill. I watched them leave, the sound of their footsteps fading into the distance. I was left alone with the rain and the map she had dropped. I picked it up, the leather still warm from her touch. I realized then that there was no turning back. We had stepped off the edge of the world, and the fall had only just begun. The whispers in the palace walls were no longer about ghosts. They were about us. I walked back to my lonely desk, the map hidden against my chest. Tomorrow the sun would rise again, and I would have to look the king in the eye while carrying his queen's soul in my pocket. The spring gala arrived like a gilded monster. The palace was suffocating under the weight of silk, perfume, and lies. I stood in the corner of the great hall, hidden behind a pillar, holding a tray I wasn't supposed to carry. I was a ghost among the living, watching the woman I loved play the role of a statue. The king sat on his throne, his hand resting heavily on her shoulder, not as a lover but as a conqueror claiming his prize. Every time he laughed, I felt a dagger twist in my gut. She looked radiant, yet dead behind the eyes. Her dress was a masterpiece of silver and pearls, so heavy she could barely breathe. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, a spark in a dark room, and then she looked away, her face as cold as the moon. But in that moment she adjusted her glove, and a small folded piece of parchment fell silently onto the red carpet. My heart stopped. I moved through the crowd like a shadow, my fingers trembling as I swept the note into my sleeve. I retreated to the servants' passage, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The note was simple, written in the same ink we shared in the library, the midnight labyrinth, where the roses have no thorns. It was a madness. The royal labyrinth was guarded, watched by eyes that never slept. But as the moon reached its peak, I found myself slipping through the iron gates, my dark cloak blending with the tall, manicured hedges. The air in the garden was thick with the scent of jasmine and betrayal. I turned corner after corner, following the map she had given me in my mind. Then, in the very heart of the maze, by the fountain that wept stone tears, I saw her. She had stripped away her silver gown, wearing only a simple white shift that made her look like a fallen star. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The king, he is asking questions about the library. He sees the way the dust has been disturbed." I stepped closer, ignoring the fear that was screaming in my veins. "Let him ask," I said, my voice low and steady. "Let the whole world ask. I would rather die for a moment of truth with you than live 1,000 years in that lie of a palace." She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears that caught the moonlight. For the first time, she didn't look like a queen. She looked like a girl who just wanted to be seen. She reached out, her fingers tracing the ink stains on my cheek. "We are playing with fire, Scribe," she murmured, her face inches from mine. "And the palace is made of dry wood." I didn't care about the fire. I only cared about the warmth of her skin. I took her hand, the one that wore the royal seal, and kissed the palm. A gesture of defiance. A gesture of war. "Then let it burn," I replied. For a moment the world was silent. No guards, no kings, no crowns. Just the sound of the fountain and our intertwined breaths. But the silence was broken by a snap, a dry branch breaking under a heavy boot. We froze. The sound came from the entrance of the labyrinth. Torches began to flicker against the green walls, casting long, monstrous shadows. "Search every corner," a voice commanded. It was the captain of the guard. The king's paranoia had finally sent his hounds into the night. She looked at me with a terror that broke my heart. "Go," she hissed. "There is a hidden door behind the ivy. Run and don't look back." I didn't want to leave her, but I knew my presence was her death sentence. I pressed the star map into her hand and whispered, "The sea is still waiting for us." I disappeared into the ivy just as the first torchlight hit the fountain. From my hiding spot, I heard the captain's voice. "Your Majesty? What are you doing here alone in the dark?" Her voice was like ice. "I am the queen. I do not need a reason to walk in my own garden." I ran through the darkness, my lungs burning, the sound of her brave lie echoing in my ears. I made it back to my cold stone room, but I knew the walls were closing in. The third act was over, and the tragedy was beginning to ripen. The ink was no longer enough. Soon we would be writing our story in something much more permanent. The morning didn't bring light. It brought the sound of splintering wood. They broke into my sanctuary at dawn. My books, my maps, my soul, scattered across the dusty floor like wounded birds. I didn't fight. A scribe's hands are meant for ink, not steel. They dragged me through the golden halls, past the portraits of dead kings who seemed to sneer at my tattered tunic. I was no longer a shadow. I was a target. The throne room was silent. Too silent. The air smelled of incense and cold fury. The king sat there, his crown glinting like a jagged mountain of gold. He didn't look like a man. He looked like an earthquake waiting to happen. In his hand he held the star map, the one she had given me. It was stained with his wine. "A scribe who dreams of the stars," he said, his voice a low growl that vibrated in my chest. "And a queen who dreams of a scribe." I stood before him, my knees shaking, but my head held high. There is a strange courage that comes when you have already lost everything. "The stars belong to everyone, Your Majesty," I whispered. "Even those who live in the dark." He stood up, his heavy cloak sweeping the floor like a shroud. He walked toward me, his shadow swallowing me whole. "In this kingdom only I decide what belongs to whom. And you are nothing but a stain on my record." He raised his hand to signal the guards, a gesture that meant my life was over. But then the heavy doors at the back of the hall burst open. She walked in. Not as the girl in the white shift from the labyrinth, but as the sovereign. She wore her crown, her robes of state, and a look in her eyes that made even the guards step back. "Enough," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was a blade of ice cutting through the king's fire. The king turned, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Ah, the stray bird returns to her cage. Look at him, Eleanor. Is this the man you would trade a throne for? A boy with ink on his fingers and nothing in his pockets." She didn't look at the king. She looked at me. In that gaze, I saw the library, the rain, the lavender, and every word we had never dared to say. "He has more in his pockets than you will ever have in your treasury," she replied softly. "He has the truth." The king's face turned a bruised purple. He grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her silk sleeves. "You are my wife, my property," he roared. She pulled away with a strength that shocked us both. She took the crown from her head, that heavy golden circle of thorns, and placed it on the cold floor between them. Clang. The sound echoed like a funeral bell. "I was never yours," she said. "I was only a ghost in your palace. But today I choose to be human." The silence that followed was terrifying. I could hear the flickering of the torches, the labored breathing of the king. He looked at the crown on the floor, then at us. "Then you shall die like humans," he hissed. "Guard, take them to the high tower. At dawn, the scribe will find his freedom at the end of a rope, and the queen will watch from the window of her new cell." As they dragged us away in opposite directions, our hands brushed one last time. A spark, a promise. I saw her lips move, a silent word intended only for me. Wait. I was thrown into a cold, damp cell at the top of the tower, the stars visible through a tiny slit in the stone. They think they have caught us. They think the story ends with a rope and a cage. But they forget. I am a scribe, and I know how to rewrite an ending. The stars were beginning to fade, turning the sky into a bruised shade of violet. I stood by the narrow slit in my cell, my hands cold, my heart steady. I didn't feel like a prisoner. For the first time in my life, I felt like the author of my own fate. The king thought he had locked me in a tower, but he forgot that a scribe knows the secrets of the stones. I felt the loose brick behind the straw, the one she had whispered about in our last meeting. Inside was a silken rope, thin but stronger than iron. I climbed down the jagged face of the cliff, the salt spray of the ocean stinging my eyes. Below, in the shadows of the Devil's Throat cave, a small boat was dancing on the black water. And there, holding a lantern shrouded in blue cloth, was a figure in a simple cloak. She had stripped away the gold, the pearls, and the lies. She was just Eleanor, and she was waiting for me. I hit the sand, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and for the first time I didn't bow. I took her in my arms, and the world finally made sense. "The guards will be at the tower in minutes," she whispered, her voice a mix of terror and triumph. We pushed the boat into the surf, the wood groaning against the pebbles. As we rowed away from the silhouette of the silver palace, we saw the torches lighting up the high windows. They were searching for a ghost and a shadow, but we were already becoming the mist. The king's crown was still lying on that cold floor, a useless circle of metal, while we had the entire ocean before us. We didn't look back. The palace became a toy, then a speck, then nothing. The sun began to rise, a pale gold ribbon on the horizon, but it didn't feel like a judge today. It felt like a witness. We followed the star map, the one that led to the islands where the wind doesn't ask for names. I looked at her, her hair wet with sea spray, her eyes finally bright with the light of the living. "Where are we going?" she asked. I picked up the oars and smiled. "To the end of the story," I said, "and the beginning of us." And now, as their boat disappears into the golden haze of the morning, it is time for you to find your own horizon. The story has reached its end, and the palace walls are far away. You are safe. You are warm. Feel the weight of your blanket, like the heavy silk of a queen's cloak, but without the burden. Your bed is your sanctuary, your silent library where no one can find you. Let your breath match the rhythm of the distant sea, in and out, like the waves that carried them to freedom. If you enjoyed this journey through the shadows and the stars, perhaps you'll consider joining our circle of night travelers. A simple like is a candle in the dark, and your subscription is the map that leads us to new stories. It helps our silent library grow so we can meet here again when the world gets too loud for your soul. Close your eyes now. The ink is dry. The book is closed. The scribe and the queen are free, and so are you. The room is dark, the air is cool, and the dreams are waiting for you just behind your eyelids. Sleep now. Sleep deep. Let the stars guide you home.